Estamos só à espera que se sentem. Ok, vamos começar. So we will conduct this session in English, so everyone can follow. First of all, welcome to FLAD. It's a pleasure to receive you in FLAD to discuss this report, which is so important for the mission of FLAD, which is to bring together Portugal and the United States, and of course we very much are invested in the transatlantic relations. Transatlantic Studies, Transatlantic Trends 2022 is a study led by the German Marshall Fund and the Bertelsmann Foundation. I thank these institutions for their work. FLAD has a long-lasting cooperation with the German Marshall Fund, and we are very pleased and proud to be able to join this study. This is an annual transatlantic survey that gathers information on public perceptions in 40 countries from Europe and North America in matters such as the position in what regards NATO, EU, security and defense cooperation, approach to Russia and China. The focus is on global challenges that will shape transatlantic relations in years to come. The countries surveyed are United States, Canada, Turkey, UK, and 10 EU member states: Portugal, France, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, and Sweden. It is a diversified group of countries that allow us to have a good understanding about the perceptions of public opinion in this transatlantic space. And, of course, that reinforces the importance of knowledge as a base for decisions, to understand and to know the perceptions and the positions of public opinion when we want to develop relevant policies and effectively being able to communicate with citizens. It is important to understand what are the citizens' perceptions and their concerns as a base for political decisions. FLAD decided to join again this study in 2022 to include Portugal amongst the countries surveyed to allow public Portuguese opinions to be considered and compared. We will have first from Gesine Weber, research analyst at GMF, will present the key findings and the overview of the report. Thank you. And then we will have a conversation with two leading Portuguese experts who have been working with us in this report, Raquel Vaz Pinto and Pedro Magalhães. And then there will be a Q&A session. Thank you for being here. There are some very interesting results that I think we are able to discuss today. Nas pastas azuis, in the blue fold, there is a copy of the report. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for this introduction, Rita, and also thank you so much to the FLAD for joining this exciting project again this year. Because if there is one major takeaway that we see when we include Portugal in this study, it is basically that these debates, are you a country that has an Atlanticist tradition or European tradition, doesn't really work in Portugal. You can be perfectly Atlanticist and Europeanist or fervently pro-European when you look at public opinion from Portugal, which from the perspective of transatlantic relations is definitely an encouraging finding. But without talking only about Portugal, I will give really now a broad overview of the study. I already see a few of you looking into the report, and you will also see some results here on screen. Before I'm talking about the data, a quick overview on the methodology. We are surveying 1,500 people in each country, online surveys via panels based on quota. So the survey is representative. The only exception for the online samples is Turkey, because here we're doing 1,000 face-to-face interviews and 500 online interviews. And without further ado, I would say, let's start. Not sure whether this here works as it's supposed to work. Okay, if you could just pull up the next slide, that would be great. Yeah, wonderful. Here we go. So the first question that that we are always asking and have also asked in the last years is how people actually see world order. And the first one is that, and this has not changed from the last year as well, that today the US are definitely seen as the most influential actor by a large majority, and this view is really shared across age groups, it is shared across countries. So looking at the world today, it still looks pretty much unipolar. In contrast, next slide please. When we're looking at how this changes or how respondents expect this to change, we see that respondents in basically all countries anticipate a very sharp decline of the US, mostly to the benefit of China, whereas the perception of Russia and the EU remains more or less stable. And what we see particularly here is that a generational gap can be observed. So first, young people in many countries tend to see the EU as more influential in 5 years, but also something that is very interesting is that young people tend to see the US lose more influence than others in international affairs. So that shows basically, if you want to put that a bit into policy, that the EU seems to deliver quite well on soft power and influence, whereas this is not directly the case for the US in the younger generation. Speaking about influence and how respondents see world order from a broader perspective, we see that Europe, in the eyes of respondents, basically pretty much looks like old Europe. So when we ask respondents, what are the 3 most influential countries? Without ranking them, just cross the 3 most influential countries. Large majorities of them say it's Germany, France, and the UK. And particularly in the context of post-Brexit Europe, it's of course interesting to see that still 55% of our respondents see or include the UK here. This is also a perception that is widely shared in Portugal. So Portuguese respondents are particularly likely, around 4 out of 5 include Germany, France and the UK, and all other countries in Portugal are really sidelined. So here this is a particularly clear picture compared to other countries, but this trend can be observed basically everywhere. What is interesting is, of course, that the US have a slightly different view of that. The UK is seen as more influential in countries that are not members of the EU, and within EU member states, people tend to see France and Germany as more influential. This is a question that is one, I think, of the author's favorite questions. And here you see our famous reliability snail. Here we single out the result for one country when we ask respondents in all other countries whether they see a country as a reliable partner for their country. An issue here is, of course, that we do not know what a respondent understands when we ask about reliability. When we ask someone in Poland at the moment, people might think much more about reliability as a military ally, whereas people, for instance, in France might think much more about energy or much more about Euro integration. So that is something to keep in mind. But what is very interesting here is that Germany has lost, it is still the third, or the country that is number 3 in terms of perceived reliability, but it has significantly lost trust among people in Poland, the US, and in Spain. And here you see that the study also reflects what is going on in the world. We also have this graph, and you can dive much more into the data later in the printed version. But what is important here, or the most important takeaway here, is that when it comes to reliability, the perception of whether a country is reliable or whether a partnership is based on reliability is basically mutual. You see that on the in the colors here. The darker the blue, the more reliability is perceived. And basically, you have always the reliability in both directions on more or less on the same level. So, for instance, if 82% or if a special share of Germans says the French are reliable, it is almost the same in the different direction, which shows that citizens seem to share a similar perception in both countries. There are a few outliers in this regard, and one is Turkey. On the one hand, Turkey is not at all seen as a reliable ally by other countries, but the Turkish respondents do also not see the other allies in a transatlantic relationship as reliable. So there is a real issue here with trust when it comes to Turkey. Another result, looking at the bottom here, is Romania, because Romania is not seen as reliable at all by other European partners, but Romanians tend to trust the other Europeans. So we do not observe a mirror effect here in terms of trust. Portugal, with 60%, ranks technically in the lower half, but it is important to underline that the don't know square result here was relatively high with 16%, whereas it is more around 7-8% who do not know how to answer that question for Germany, France, or the UK. So also 60%, it still means that you have quite a significant share of people seeing Portugal as reliable, but also that some just do not know. So that's an important takeaway. And looking at the Portuguese results, you see that the Portuguese really also see the European partners as very reliable. France, Germany rank first here, but also Spain, Sweden, and Canada. And the numbers are very high. And that is also something that we could observe in the entire study. Overall, Portuguese people, I would say, are optimistic. So that is the main takeaway here, because we see that like a golden thread in the entire study. Portugal often ranks among the countries that say that the EU, let's say, is important, or NATO is important, or that partners are reliable. So that tells us, from a research perspective, a lot about the mood in a country when it comes to global challenges. A question that we are also always asking is, now diving a bit more into transatlantic relations, whether people approve the foreign policy of President Biden. And overall, on average, this is the case. Interestingly, the Americans themselves are among the most skeptical here. Then we have another graph that we think is very important when it comes to addressing the future of the transatlantic relationship, because it comes down to politicians that are elected and that might take decisions, and that is the question of the state of democracy. Good news for Portugal. Portugal is among the countries where respondents have the most positive outlook on their national democracy. With 65% saying that Portuguese democracy is either in an excellent or good state. It's only in Sweden it is slightly higher, but it's the second highest share in the survey and significantly above the average in EU countries, which is 52%. And then we see here, of course, some numbers that are highly concerning, particularly when we take into consideration that these numbers were a bit lower last year. They are slowly but steadily going up in all these countries where people see democracy in danger. And in the US, you now have 30% of respondents saying that US democracy is in danger. And particularly for the 2024 elections, that's definitely something that Europeans also should be concerned about. We see that here a bit more detailed, and when you see these smaller lines, that basically shows the shifts from 2021, and particularly in the UK, but also in the US, you see that people now have a much more pessimistic outlook on national democracy. A question that was basically inspired here from Lisbon when we drafted the questionnaire is how people want to address global challenges, because we do not only have this external dimension of internal dimension of democracy, but also as an external question, whom do you want to work with in international affairs? And we see that overall people say, yes, if we address global questions, we want our country to do that with democracies. And here, again, Portugal is the country where you have the highest share of people supporting that agenda and saying our country should only cooperate with democracies. Interestingly, this score is lowest in the countries where it is explicitly, and also on the international level, very present in the foreign policy agendas, namely the US, I mentioned the Summit for Democracy here, and the United States with the Network of Liberties. So it seems that these policies are not really carried by the public, but that they could be championed from other countries like Portugal, Sweden, or also, for instance, Poland or Spain. Diving a bit in the security and defense questions, a question that we already asked last year and also this year, unsurprisingly, NATO is seen as much more important this year than it was seen last year. I don't have to explain the context. I guess we all know where that comes from. But what is interesting is that it really went up also in countries that basically have not really a NATO tradition or a strong endorsement of NATO, such as in France. And you now see that on average you have almost 4 out of 5 people who say that NATO is important, and even in the countries where that rank on the bottom here, like Italy, Sweden, but also the US, even there it's 3 out of 2 respondents. So you can't say that it's low in nominal terms just because it's on the bottom. There is a similar trend that we can observe when it comes to the preference for US involvement in European defense and security. And we see that this since 2020, we only have the comparison for France, Germany, and the US for the 2020 values, has steadily gone up. But what is particularly interesting is that the biggest jump was from 2020 to 2021 and not from 2021 to 2020. So we see that there's a continued trend, but we also see that there might indeed be this Biden bump that could be observed in the first time. And here again, you see there are a few champions when it comes to preference for US involvement in European security. And that also shows basically an interesting pattern, because unsurprisingly you see Poland and Lithuania on top here, but also Portugal. And we see that Portugal often aligns in terms of public opinion with Lithuania, Romania, and also often Sweden or Spain. So these 5 can often be found together, which is actually interesting. This, I would say, is among the biggest surprises of the report. Because you just remember that we asked the NATO question, whether NATO is important for national security, and we really wanted to get a sense of how people see that for the EU. And in the EU, 81% say the EU is important for national security. That's exactly the same share as the average for EU countries. The other average you saw was for the entire study, but it really shows that EU and NATO are on the same level. And interestingly, in this regard, these numbers are particularly high also in Poland. Also Portugal is among the first ones here, and relatively, I say relatively, low in Germany or France, but we are still talking about 3 out of 4 people who say that it's important. And even in the UK, it's still around 2 out of 3, which shows that maybe the government wants to reconsider in London that even if there's Brexit, the EU isn't going to go away in the public perception. And that is also a trend that this idea that the EU is important for security is also something that we see when we ask people how they want to manage relations with Russia and China. overall, there is very little appetite for bilateral cooperation. So with the US, so on average, 9% want to manage their country's bilateral relations with Russia through bilateral cooperation to the US. And it's similar for China. And yeah, that also is a graph that is more easily to read in the paper version. But you see here the second option is the EU option. And no matter whether we are talking about managing relations with Russia or managing relations with China, EU countries really want to do that through the EU, or respondents in EU countries. And here again, you see some outliers, and one of these outliers is Portugal, where the preference for an EU approach is particularly high. One other question that we asked was, how do people actually want to react to the war in Ukraine? And what we see here is that there is, first of all, quite a lot of consensus. So overall, people want their countries to take more action, and there is unsurprisingly very high support for prosecution of Russia for war crimes, which is, let's say, if you want to put it a bit bluntly, an easy option, because it mostly doesn't apply any kind of cost for countries. Whereas the appetite for sending NATO troops is lower. It is the option that has lowest support, but it is still at 46%. And that is something, given that it is not really discussed in the policy sphere, is quite surprising. Yeah, you see that here support for basically everything is quite high. You find some outliers, but there is very high support in basically all countries for harder sanctions, even if it hits or even if it implies an economic cost. And that's important because we did that survey when the gas prices were highest in Europe. So that is basically something that works. And yeah, also the idea of an embargo is something that is well received by the public. I will now need to speed up a bit so that we can still dive into a discussion. We'll quickly dive into the China chapter, where we basically see that it's really a challenge for people to tell us whether China is a partner, competitor, or rival in the bilateral relationship, because you see here that the don't know part is basically the same as a competitor. And that is also a trend that we see really in many countries, showing that even if respondents say China will significantly gain in terms of influence in the next 5 years, they have basically not so much of an idea of what that means in bilateral relations. However, what people are making up their mind about is how they want their country to approach China. We asked that for several policy domains, and one that is standing out here is, or there are two that are standing out. One is human rights, where respondents in all countries, except for Turkey, want their country to take a tougher approach on China, and you see here that support is particularly high in these European countries and Canada, but that is something that is shared across the survey. Whereas, particularly on new technologies, the flavor or the appetite for cooperation outweighs the appetite for a tougher approach. And what is interesting in that regard as well is that Americans and Europeans significantly diverge when it comes to the policy areas where they want a tougher approach. Europeans want a tougher approach, let's say, on climate change. They want a tougher approach, particularly on human rights, and also want a tougher approach on, mostly these two, admittedly. And whereas the US particularly want a tougher approach on exactly new technologies, trade, and raw materials. So the fields where Europeans are actually quite keen to cooperate with China, which shows that China is definitely going to be a challenge, not only when it comes to the policy perspective, but also to communicating that to the public when it comes down to transatlantic cooperation. But the interesting news is that when people want a tougher approach, they are very likely to accept an economic cost of that. That's also the case in Portugal, but a bit less, for instance, in Romania. So we basically see when respondents want to be tough on any policy area, they are also very willing to keep that approach. Last question, and then I promise I'm closing, because that's also a nice opener here. That's the scenario of an invasion of Taiwan. We asked people, we gave them 5 options. What do you want to do if China invades Taiwan? Just do nothing? Do you want to have sanctions with other countries? Do you want to act only on the diplomatic level, send arms or send troops? Well, you see the results here. 4% would be willing to send arms, 2% would want to send troops, and even in the US, that's not significantly higher. So we're talking about 8% in the US for arms, 7% for troops, which basically shows, and that is the question where we are observing that really to the biggest extent, that policy and public opinion diverge significantly. In other words, 85% of Americans would not want to send arms or troops as their preferred option, whereas that are options that are openly discussed by the government. So that is something that this question has sparked a lot of concern in our briefings, let's put it like that. But the good news is that the public on both sides of the Atlantic really aligns. Not taking any option is not a preferred option, whereas there is a large consensus of 3 out of 4 respondents for sanctions or diplomatic action. So there might be a possibility to cooperate on that. Yeah, you see that here as well. And now I've been talking way too long, and I'm sorry for that, but I hope that you get kind of a flavor of the report. And now I'm looking forward to diving into that a bit more.
We can start. I'm supposed to be both speaker and moderator. I hope I'm able to moderate myself in this discussion. I wanted to start by thanking the foundation and the president for inviting. There's a lot of echo. Thanking the foundation and the president for inviting me. I would also like to congratulate the foundation for reviving this connection to the German Marshall Fund. Of course, I'm suspect. I'm a public opinion person, so I love these data, and I think it's important they're available. But I think there's a deeper reason that makes these data important. And the deeper reason is there's a lot of discussion, of course, in research about what influences what. Is it public opinion that influences policy, or policy influences public opinion? I think we know that in the foreign policy domain, of course, the ability of public opinion to constrain political action is smaller than in other domains, but it's still relevant. So the fact that we know these results, that we have these data, that we know what people from different countries want in terms of foreign policy is not irrelevant in terms of how democratic, in a sense, foreign policy can be. So I think it's wonderful that these data are available, not only for my own personal interest as a researcher, but from a democratic point of view. And I also, I'm taking too long on this introduction, but I also like to congratulate the German Marshall Fund on the report. I mean, on the entire work, but especially on the report. It's very difficult to be able to present these data in a way that is well understandable, clear, and I think that you've done a wonderful job. It's an exemplary report that I'm going to copy very often in my own work. So, on the results, Raquel and I more or less divided work among ourselves. So I'm going to stress, I think, 4 ideas. So the first idea is something that Gesine already mentioned. It's this dilemma that sometimes appears both in policy and in political discourse and sometimes in public opinion between Europe and the United States, between Europe and the Atlantic. And as you've said yourself, and I think that the results show it, although they're not new, we kind of knew this already, but it's interesting that the results confirm it. This dilemma does not exist for Portuguese public opinion. So 83% of respondents have a positive feeling about the influence of the European Union in the world. It's the highest percentage of the 14 countries. And 73% express a positive feeling about the influence of the United States in the world, also one of the highest values. This does not mean that the respondents are completely unrealistic about the degrees of influence of these two actors in the world. So as you probably saw before, only 22%, it's still significant, think that the EU is more influential than the United States. But most leave that role to the United States. But I think that this also means that it also causes that the Portuguese views about US-Europe relations end up being extremely positive, extremely optimistic, more than in most countries that we saw. So we are among the countries where a more favorable scenario for these relationships is envisaged. So 42% think that relationships will be closer. If you look at the UK, it's 14%, France is 16%, Italy 17%. So we have a singular, and this again, this is not new, but from the point of view of public opinion, and I would risk to some extent, at least in most moments in time, from the point of view of public policy, Portugal has had a role and has had as a view of things, most Portuguese, that does not see Europe and the Atlantic as a dilemma. And I think that this is interesting, a first point that I wanted to stress. The other thing I wanted to stress, and this is a bit of a surprise to me, and maybe not to Raquel, we can talk about this later, maybe not to Gesine, is that most Portuguese respondents isolate ourselves from the rest or stress particularly something which is a very negative view about the role not only of Russia, but also of China in the world. And this was a bit surprising to me. I mean, not Russia, of course, in the context that we are living. 84% think that the influence of Russia in international affairs has been negative. It's the highest value of all 14 countries. But 61% think that the influence of China is also negative. And this is also one of the highest of the 14, and it's higher than the United States. And this was very striking to me, a bit of a surprise. This is going to have, and Raquel is going to mention this is going to have implications about the way the Portuguese think that relations with these countries need to be managed. And it also has an interesting implication, and I'm very happy that in the end the German Marshall Fund decided to use one of our proposed questions, the one about if regime type matters in terms of cooperation. And you see that in the Portuguese case, 67% think that Portugal should only cooperate with democratic regimes. It's again the highest value of the 14 countries. The average is 53, as we just saw. And the United States, of course, a realist country, it's 38%. But idealism in foreign policy is also important, and that foreign policy people will explain. It's not my case. But I think it's very striking, and I see it as connected. This preference for relations with democratic countries, I see it as connected with the first thing I just said, which is the very negative view of the role of Russia, not surprising, of the role of China, a bit more surprising, and I guess a bit more consequential in terms of the relationship between Portugal and China in multiple domains, first and foremost, the economic one. The third idea I wanted to stress is that although there are a few exceptions, and I think age is one of those exceptions that Gesine already mentioned, and Raquel I'm sure will mention, the most important things that divide the Portuguese along these opinions are not social demographic in nature. And this is not surprising at all. So for example, people's views on issues such as social policy, the economy, even immigration, even the environment, are much more determined, are much more related with social demographic features of respondents, like age, education, very important always in Portugal, income. In foreign policy, it doesn't really work like that. It doesn't really work like that because it's a different realm of policy that may have, of course, and has, we know, economic implications, but they are not felt so directly. So the strongest variable or explaining variations among the Portuguese in terms of their foreign policy positions are political variables, right? Our messages are variables that have to do with what people hear from the political leaders, from the elites that they give credit to. So you won't be surprised if I tell you that 66% of the Portuguese approve of US foreign policy, but among partisans of the Communist Party, this drops to 45%. Interestingly, the partisans of Chega are also a bit different here, also 45%. And in the opposite direction, you see supporters of the Socialist Party, 79%. So two things I wanted to stress here. So there's a relationship here. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that it's not so strong as one might think. So remember, 45% of people who support the Communist Party approve of the US's international policy, foreign policy. The two things are true at the same time, right? So there's a political structuring behind these opinions, but it's not as deep, it's not as overwhelming, it's not as strong as one might think. And I know Raquel will be talking about this when we talk about Ukraine. Is the US a reliable partner? 71% of the sample says yes, a little bit less among the young, 60, but much less among partisans of the Communist Party, 34%. And in fact, partisans of the Communist Party are different from everybody else in what concerns the reliability of the UK, of France, of Germany, of Italy, even Spain, right? 27% said Spain is unreliable against 12% of the population. My point, I'm not making a speech about the political priorities or rhetoric of the Communist Party or any party, but the point I want to make is that if you want to look for things that structure divisions, that make people different, that explains variation in these attitudes, and it's not easy because in many responses, the response is overwhelmingly in one direction. But if you're looking for something, you should look for politics. Politics makes a difference. Last comment, it's a bit of a curiosity. The Portuguese really like to know what foreigners think about us. I don't know if you notice. It's like a national sport. We are very, very much into that. We really, really want to know. It happens a lot with countries that were very powerful in the past, and the Iranians are the same. But let me tell you that almost nobody in these 14 countries thinks that we are the most influential, which makes sense. The other interesting thing is that only 6% of the Portuguese think that Portugal is the most influential country. You think it's 6%, I mean, that's already a lot. But it's less than in most other countries, right? Only Lithuanians are as modest as we are. Everybody else, in some cases understandably, in some cases with some amount of national delusion, think that their country is more influential. On average, 60% think that we are among the most reliable. We are far from Sweden, which is understandable. We're also far from Turkey, which is seen as the least reliable. We are close to Italy, and interestingly, but not surprisingly, we are now close to the United Kingdom, which is not seen as reliable as it was in the past. And I don't think that for, all the political developments we've had in the recent years, this will be seen as very surprising. And we ourselves make the kind of distinction that everybody else makes. It's a distinction between the West and the East. Mm-hmm. And we are somewhere there in the middle. There are many reasons behind this, also lots of stereotypes behind this. The attitudes about Turkey, we may think, well, with the political developments in Turkey, it's understandable. But this was true before Turkey was the kind of non-democratic, autocratic regime it is today. So there are a lot of things mixed in here. But this positioning, in a sense, it's not surprising, and it's common to almost all the countries that we see. So these are the comments I had for, let's say, the first part of the report. And now I will ask Raquel to make comments about the second half of the report. Raquel.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. First of all, I would like also to reinforce Pedro's comments regarding the fact that Portugal is, again, within the transatlantic trends. And I would just like to make a very, for me, it was, I think, one of the best professional news that I had this year. And let me just explain this. In 2014-15, I had this idea of writing an essay about how do the Portuguese see the world? How do they perceive which countries are friends, enemies, somewhere in between, ages, and so forth? And I had this idea, and I submitted to a common friend of ours for an essay. And the response was, this is such a great idea. Please, when can you submit your draft? And then it dropped me, and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? So I had a kind of a Ghostbuster moment. Who are you going to call? And I called Pedro. Surveys, inquiries. And so I dived into the transatlantic trends world. I was absolutely fascinated. I did the essay. It was for me an enormous professional challenge. I was way out of my comfort area, but it was really fulfilling because we sometimes tend to look at the international as something far away beyond our common daily life. And it's not so at all. And in the sense that when I was going through the trends, when I was going through the results, most of them were highly coherent in terms of the perspectives, the perceptions, the tendencies of how we Portuguese look at the world. So, and when the decision was made to withdraw from the transatlantic trends, I'll never forget the care, the extra care that Pedro took to just, bring it to me and give me the bad news. It was wonderful, as it was wonderful when I knew that we were back on track. So I thank Rita, because for us, for professors of international relations, this is an awesome, extraordinary tool to explain, to understand, to be able to give to our students quantitative, empirical data that they can work with. So that's my first pitch. The second one is regarding something that for me was not a surprise at all. This is something that it has been consolidated over the years. It's Portuguese society, Portuguese perceptions see, and this it's overwhelming. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a security challenge. And that is something that it has been coherent, consistent and for so many years now. And I think that this, even in a year in which we have this dreadful and horrendous war in the Ukraine, environmental climate change comes on top. And I think that's something that it would be, I would say, interesting and perhaps rewarding to see our politicians in general discussing climate change as a national security issue. Secondly, I would like to focus on the results for Russia and the war itself, and lastly, the issues, the results regarding China. As to Russia, I mean, Gesine has touched upon the many points that I think are quite obvious. We have an enormous, I mean, I went to the previous reports to see how we Portuguese looked at Russia. And, you know, it was not a very favorable image, but it was rather a kind of, you know, I really don't know, it's something distant. It was not perceivable. Of course, with the war going on, we have 84% of the Portuguese that have a negative approach, perception of Russia, and that is very significant, I would say, in terms of our political discussion. But what we found quite interesting is when I look at the numbers and I look at the partisan affiliation, the numbers for the CDU, which is the Portuguese Communist Party plus the Greens, the detailing was quite interesting. It tells us that partisans of the Communist Party are much more heterogeneous than we would tend to think if we would just pay attention or listen to the declarations of regarding the war itself. For instance, the popular measures to support Ukraine, which include prosecuting Russia. Gesine pointed out that this is an easy measure. I mean, it has no bearing in your daily life. But even so, 56% of partisans of the Communist Party said it was a good idea. At the same time, for instance, when we look at taking in large numbers of Ukrainian refugees, imposing stronger economic sanctions on Russia, there is, of course, this idea, even the stronger economic sanctions on Russia, which in general was 88%, and from partisans of the CDU, it's 47%. It's a really high number within a political party that has been, I would say, in this case, rather the exception than the norm in terms of how you perceive the war going on in the Ukraine. And I think that's quite interesting here in terms of our political landscape. I would also like to highlight that Portugal was the country with the highest support for the enlargement of NATO regarding Sweden and Finland. 90% for Sweden, 73% for Finland. And to reinforce an idea that for us it was definitely not new, and Pedro has already highlighted, there is no dilemma between being strongly Atlanticist and strongly European in Portugal. So, and I think that's actually a good thing and something that we need to actually reinforce. Lastly, China. I could talk about, as you know, I could talk about China for hours. I will not. It was not, for me, it was not a surprise. When we look at the previous data and from other barometers, it's actually, there has been a steady increase of the negative perception of China, although with different nuances as to the different sectors, as the report also highlights as well. Our negative view of China is 61%. It's slightly higher than the average. But when you break it down to specific issues and sectors, this is, as writers of crime stories would say, this is where the plot thickens. A plurality of Portuguese respondents described China as a partner, 44%, really higher than the average, 26%. And it is quite noteworthy that 28% of Portuguese could not actually, call it either a partner, a rival, or a competitor. They had no formed opinion on the issue. It's almost 1/3. And what I would like to emphasize regarding China is, in fact, here, the question of age. For me, it was quite striking to see that in the younger generation, the first year of age from 18 to 24, and then from 25 to 39, the numbers are higher looking at China as a partner or preferring non-confrontational measures rather than older, I would say older, more experienced generations. And this is, I think, interesting, particularly in the issue of new technologies, which for obvious reason is a no in terms of the US population, everything regarding the 5G, Huawei, ZTE, and so forth. But in Portugal, it's actually an area in which the biggest preference is for cooperation with China. It's 39%. But if you look at the tier of 18 to 24 years, it's 55%. So I think that in many of these issues, either it be trade, energy, there is, I would perhaps say, a different generational idea or perception of how you look into China. And I think this needs to be further developed, further research in order for us to really understand what's going on in terms of the way we look at all of this in general. And I had many things that I would like to comment. I will not. I would just like to actually reinforce Pedro and his comment in general. This is a report that is very easy to read, to understand. It's an example of how you should read a report, how you should write a report if you want the general public to read it and to actually understand the issue. So thank you so much, because I think it's a wonderful exercise of putting academic work and communication skills. It's a perfect match, and so and I think I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. We have some time allotted for a conversation, but I plan to do the following. So I would ask you, Gesine, besides what you already presented, if you wanted to add something or if you have any comment to the things that we said. And then we would move to the audience, because I'm looking at the audience and I see an extremely qualified audience with whom I hope to learn something rather than answering questions. So let's go to Gesine first, and then we open for Q&A.
Well, as both of you are working in the field, you know that I could also be talking about the data for ages, so stop me, please, if I'm going too far. But one point I would like to take up is really this question of age gaps, because that is something that we see across countries and across questions, and that is also something that we already saw last year. For last year, I authored a separate policy brief on that, and that might also come this year. But what we see is not only that China is perceived as more influential, and also that young people look at it a bit more positively. We also see that they are much more critical of the US.
Yes.
And that this classical transatlantic transatlantic preference, or that this appreciation of the US cannot be taken for granted among younger people. For China, I explained that, as you already said, for instance, also with new technologies. But I would say it's not, or it would be too simplistic to say we have a generation TikTok that just to exaggerate a bit, it just loves China because they are scrolling on social media all the time and seeing China all there. I don't think that's correct, because we see that, as you said, this age gap is a bit broader for the China questions than for other questions. So it's more like people older than 40 and younger than 40. And that coincidence exactly with the arrival of Confucius Institutes in Europe, with increased exchange of Chinese and European students, like Europeans going to China, Chinese students more presence on the European campuses. And on the other hand, when we look at this relatively low appreciation of the US, of US influence, of seeing the US as less influential in 5 years among the younger generation, or among the youngest generation, Gen Z, 18 to 24, for me, that is quite coherent when I think about what world this generation has basically seen over the last years. The oldest people in the youngest age group are now 24. That means that at the time when they started being allowed to vote at 18, we had Brexit and Trump became president. Whereas the EU, which is seen as a bit more influential and which younger people also think will become much more influential, has actually been leveling up a bit. I mean, the global strategy fell a bit under the public radar, but particularly in the last years with the COVID recovery plan, with the Green Deal, with Recover, and all these EU initiatives, that all is quite a coherent picture. But what I think also to dive a bit more in these age differences is really interesting again, is that we really see this gap in almost all countries. There is one exception when it comes to global influence, and that are young French people who tend to see US influence much more positive than elders. And that was something that we did not expect at all, knowing that French people in general are a bit critical of the US. But we really see that there is kind of, that this mind shift is not impacted by borders, but that it is more a generational issue than a national issue, which is potentially interesting to keep in mind. And what I really liked about your remarks, and I will close on that so that we can really have a bit of a conversation here, was this idea of connecting this negative outlook on Russia and China to the idea of wanting mostly to cooperate with democratic regimes. And I think that for Portugal this is very coherent, but when we see that with other countries, I think that it's very interesting actually to see that there are countries that have a certain, like where you have a relatively high share of people saying that China is a competitor or rival, like in the US or in the UK. And these are basically the countries where this preference for cooperation with democracies is lowest. So I think it's interesting to see that when it comes to, I mean, you could maybe even say when it comes to power politics, then you turn opportunistic at one point. Could be a hypothesis to discuss, but maybe I close here and give back to you.
Thank you. I promised I was going to give the word to the audience, but I'm just going to say a couple of things. And this may sound like a very technical point, but it's a very important point. It's very difficult to sort out the effect of age from the effect of generation. And the reason is obvious, right? When you look at one particular survey, the people who are younger also belong to a particular generation. And you don't know if what you're seeing when you, for example, compare people with different ages is an effect of life cycle, meaning people get older, their life experience changes, their views about things changes, or if it's the effect of being socialized, of having a particular experience in a point in life where you were impressed by something. So the wonderful thing that Transatlantic Trends allows, and the wonderful thing that the fact that we are back starts to allow, is that when you have a series of surveys through time, you can start sorting out these effects. Because the people who were young when Transatlantic Trends started are not so young anymore, right? So you can't sort out the effect of life cycle from the effect of cohort, from the effect of generation. And that's another reason, I admit a very technical reason, but I think substantively important reason why it is important to keep continuity in these surveys, because there are questions. It's not only the question of let's see how things change. It's also a question that there are substantive questions you cannot answer if you don't have a series of surveys. And that's so another reason why it's wonderful that we're back. Unless you want to add something?
No.
So I would open the question and answer periods, or question and question back period. Michael.
Congratulations to everyone who worked on the report. It's fantastic. I was just looking through it. I guess a comment and a question. So comment is, in these surveys on international relations, obviously we're asking people to exhibit their feelings about countries, right? When we're not quite sure what that means, right? Are they referring primarily to the government in power in those countries? When you think of all the Russian men who are leaving Russia right now, are attitudes towards Russia, or is it attitudes towards Putin? So this is, I think, just an important reminder, I guess, comment that IR often extrapolates between the individual and the national level, and I always find that, worrisome as a comparativist. My comment is really for Raquel and Pedro, who are familiar with the trend data, and I guess one of my questions is, one thing I know Pedro knows very, very well is that attitudes in Portugal towards the EU have been shown to be highly volatile depending on what's happening in the national economy. Some people say instrumentalist in terms of its orientation. And so I guess, Raquel, if you've been looking at the trend data up till 13 or 14, both on Portuguese attitudes towards the EU and especially Portuguese attitudes to Germany, which I found fascinating, are so positive now, post-Troika. How volatile are those numbers, and what do you think is going to happen if we see a deep recession here in the next few years?
Maybe I'll collect a couple more. I see Tomaso Bruno, and then in the back.
Henrique.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the question, Henrique Brunet. I was curious, I came actually because I was quite curious about one data, and you've been discussing that, which is in relation to China. And one of the reasons why I had a very small sample this summer of a group of youth that was at an event organized by the European Commission. And I was curious because they were discussing the fact that China was clearly more on the agenda and there was an issue with China, there were tensions. But when asked, why did they think there was a problem with China, was the problem? Many of them, I would dare say most of them, or at least half of them, couldn't exactly say what was the problem. And if there was a problem, probably was economic competition, but I mean the idea that there's a rival that is ideologically as a system is opposed to ours wasn't very clear for the majority of them. It was a very small sample, but I'm afraid that it's confirmed by this data. And Raquel mentioned that this deserves more research. My question is, and I don't know if I should address it to you or not, but it's my question is, okay, certainly more research, but eventually more political action. Because I think that this data is, if you were to ask this to policymakers, their response would probably be much different. So I would guess there should be some action regarding this, but I don't know which one. Secondly, just a comment. I'm totally not surprised that you find many of the Chega voters with a negative opinion about the US. I think it's very, very expectable. That's part of the right wing that dislikes the US, has always disliked it. So it confirms something that I would expect, but it's interesting.
So Bruno?
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank FLAD because as you mentioned, we really lack these kinds of polls. I was just teaching a class yesterday using data from the Pew Research Center, and this was a really international class, but they were complaining, why don't we have data for Portugal? Yeah. And of course, this has been a topic with Pedro, and Pedro always reminds me, well, polls cost money, so someone has to pay for us to have that kind of data, so thank you. I think that's really important. Just very brief comments. One is, I think, I was really worried with the numbers about how optimistic the Portuguese are with technology and the way we are going to, solve all problems in terms of transition to this disruptive technology. I think that's completely delusional, so I'm hoping that policymakers will correct this. But the two other comments / suggestions, one is, I arrived slightly late, so maybe you mentioned this, but I think it would be useful to have this, even if this working report on the Portuguese data. So some of this data about, for instance, party divisions in terms of perceptions would be really interesting. And in terms of the point about views of the US, I think in terms of future polls, it would be interesting to maybe have a question asking people what influences their perception of the US. Is it the US president? Is it gun violence? Is it racism? I think that would be interesting. Thank you.
So,
Hello, good afternoon, and congratulations for this report. I would like to make two questions. One is, how did you choose people for the survey? Did you choose people from different regions of Portugal and other countries? One is that. And the other is that one. When respondents started to answer the survey, did they knew from the start that it was also important to say what was their party preference, political preference? So when did that questions appeared? In the beginning, in the end? You know, I would like to know that as well. I think it's important.
Very well. So I guess that we can now have a round of reactions. Maybe I would ask Gesine, regardless of whatever other comment you may have, these last technical questions are important.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I'll start with the question on how we choose people for the survey. Basically, it is an online survey which is conducted through so-called online panels with self-completion. So people first have to answer several demographic questions. So before answering the question, they are asked about their age, about their social economic background, like are they a student, are they working, about their party preference. So yes, party preference is asked before they are actually answering all the rest. So that is one of these background variables that are polled by the polling company or that are checked by the polling company to then see whether they or how they use or integrate this person in the sample. And overall, the idea is that the criteria for the sample are always based on national standards. So, for example, in Germany, you always have 4 regions: north, east, south, west. And this is the case for almost all surveys conducted there. And then our polling company takes this national standard for regions and applies it for the countries. So that is the same for Portugal. Here there is also a regional standard that is normally applied for surveys, and that is then also the case for the Transatlantic Trends study. And after people have completed these demographic factors and have filled out the questionnaire, the data are weighted according to the actual representation in the country to make it representative of the country. I hope that answers the question on the methodological side.
I just think one thing. There are many people in Portugal that don't have at all any party preference.
And that was
So did you have that answer that they don't prefer any party?
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
So the option no party affiliation is an
Okay.
option that you
Thank
can indicate in the questionnaire, just as the other parties. Like normally we really have almost all parties in the political system on the questionnaire, but sometimes out of a sample of 1,500, you sometimes have literally 20 people who would vote for a certain party and then have certain opinions, and that is statistically not significant at all. That's why we mostly always only use these results. After this technical aspect, I would like to dive into that question on relations with China and the younger generation first. And this question, what's the problem? Like that people cannot identify it. That is something that we also see in many other countries or overall and across generation, when we're looking or when we're a bit cross-referencing the questions that we see in the report. Because yes, even in countries where people say that China is a rival or a competitor, or also in age groups where they do it, people do not see China as a security challenge at all. We have the question on security challenges, we put China in there as an item, and 2% on average see China as a security challenge. Even when we ask them as a control question, what is the second most important security challenge? So not only the first one, really for us as a background knowledge, what's number 2? They do not choose China. So this link between Chinese influence is maybe negative, but it is really a security issue for us that's not present in the public perception at all. And that is also then again linked to this result that we see that almost 1/3 across countries is not able to tell whether China is a competitor, a rival, or a partner, which basically shows, yes, we need more China education. And there is in all countries the need for people to speak Chinese also, or to teach it a bit more in schools, to have a better understanding of also discourse, and also overall maybe teach also Chinese history and China and international affairs. Like when I think of what I learned in school, I never learned anything about Chinese history that would maybe allow me to better understand the geopolitical ambitions of China today. And I think this kind of, whereas in my education I could tell you how the Congress in the US is elected, which is important, but in a changing world order, there is a missing piece. And I think that is really the task of politicians today, to reinforce this need for China education, particularly among younger people who are now like coming in this world order where China is just very present, but also, I guess, about the more experienced generations, as you put it, to really have some to really have a sense of these questions. Yeah, that was the main point I wanted to touch upon.
Raquel, you want to react?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer Michael's questions. Well, the first comment, it was quite interesting. I remember when I was looking into the perceptions of the Bush administration, and the perceptions of the US in general were very positive as usual, but the perception, the evaluation of the Bush administration, it was like it started high, and when Obama is elected, it goes actually up. So I think that when you do ask the question and you distinguish between country and, in this case, the head of state, it's coherent with a lot of other questions that you have within the surveys. So that I think is in the sense that it reinforces the perception that you have, that the tendency is to have a favorable image of the United States in that particular case. But you are very right. I mean, when we are talking about, are we talking about Russia or Vladimir Putin? When we talk about China, are we discussing the leadership of Xi Jinping or whatever? But I think that in this particular issue, it was very interesting to see the fluctuation. On the on being volatile regarding the EU, yes, absolutely. There is an element of the highs and lows. I remember a question that was asked for many years in the Transatlantic Trends, which was about economic vulnerability. And the Portuguese response was usually, if not the highest, one of the highest, in the sense of we are any fluctuation, any change, and we are aware that from an economic point of view, we are very vulnerable. And that was usually the big concern. The same with the questions about China. In the beginning of the trends, there were no questions with China. And then it starts to rise, it starts to appear. And then there was this question, is China a military threat? No. Is China an economic threat or opportunity? Yes and no. So it's like, it's also very indicative of the complexity of what is changing in the world. As to these surveys, these results, I think that they're also linked to the perception of the resilience plan to help Portuguese society cope with the systemic, the socioeconomic impact of COVID. Absolutely, yes. So there is that element, especially if we now have, I hope, more years, more surveys, and what Pedro was talking about, being able to compare the different political moments to the moments of if there is a tendency or not. So that would be my answer.
May I add something to
Yes.
Yeah, but I would like to add to this question of economic vulnerability and the appreciation for the EU is, I think in that context, it's going to be very interesting to look at this question of how important the EU is for national security, because here also Portugal is among the countries with the highest share of respondents seeing the EU important for national security. And even if we phrased it as national security, which is in expert circles quite explicit, like military and hard security, we do not know what respondents understand by that. And the fact that is particularly high in some countries, for instance, also like Portugal, Lithuania, but also Poland, we see it high in Sweden. Like we don't know what people understand by it, and it could in fact be that it's this mix of on the one hand, military security and EU action in Ukraine, but also financial stability and recovery plans.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something to keep in mind here, that this might have influenced that.
Mm-hmm. If I may also make some, this is a difficult role, moderator and speaker, but it's just in response to some of the comments. So let me again make the pitch for the need for a longitudinal analysis, because the question that you ask is a question that can only be properly answered if you have variation in leadership in countries. Mm-hmm. And as Raquel said, I remember the results when George W. Bush was president, and I remember how they changed when Obama became president. From the Portuguese point of view, they didn't change dramatically in some things, but noticeably. And very dramatically in terms of the approval of the leadership. So I completely agree that these things need to be sorted out between the generic, sometimes stereotype people have about a particular country or particular population, other ideas that are mixed with this, and then evaluations of governments, of leaders. I think that's very important. The other thing I wanted to say was about the EU. And I agree, I mean, you know this very well, that not only in Portugal, but in other countries, attitudes about the EU have, as you said, kind of an instrumental component, which is when the economy is doing badly, people generic attitudes about institutions degrade, and they also degrade about the EU, not least because governments tend to blame the EU for everything that goes wrong and to claim credit for everything that goes right. So that component is certainly there, and we know that it varies with time. But there's another component which is more permanent and doesn't change that much in Portugal, which is the association between Europe, democracy, development, good governance. That's always there. And it's not only a Portuguese thing. One of the most interesting findings that we have in this literature is that the more corrupt people believe their leaders to be, the more they love the EU. Yeah. Because they think Brussels is this mythical realm of good governance. And in a sense, it may be. I mean, I'm not saying it's not. But there is this projection effect. It's not projection. There's a word for this, I don't remember. There's this effect where people praise the EU in the same demand, in the same weight that they are skeptical of their own governance. And this helps, favorable Portuguese attitudes about the EU, rightly or wrongly, but everybody in Portugal thinks politicians are all corrupt. So, and I'm not exaggerating. It's like 80-something%. So the third thing I wanted to say, and it's in reaction to Bruno, the economy of producing a questionnaire is very complicated. But I would be very curious, as I think you are, to go deeper. And I think maybe, FLAD is interested, and maybe, the US Embassy is interested, and maybe, I don't know, in going deeper in this idea of what is behind the opinions and representations people have of the US. Mm-hmm. Because I'm going to speculate. I'm pretty confident that this general approval of Biden and this favorable view about the influence of the U.S., it's one thing. It's a potentially very different thing, what at least a lot of Portuguese think about American society. and to decompose this image of the U.S. in things like sports and entertainment and racial relations and health service. People have all these ideas, rightly or wrongly, but I'm sure they have, and I'm sure they are not all convergent. So it'll be very interesting to have, but of course questionnaires have a limit, but this is something I would personally be very curious to know. I know of some results, for example, about Portuguese views about the UK from this point of view. And the contrasts are very interesting, and I'm sure that in the case of the US, they'll probably be even starker and also interesting. So, not speaking anymore. Now, moderator, more questions or comments? Here in front.
Now it is. For someone who is involved in this business of international relations, there's no surprises. At least there are no significant surprises in this report, which is good. There's some certain fatigue of surprises, at least negative surprises. The second issue is that there's lots of common sense in this, and even wisdom in some aspects, which is also good. In my point of view, the question / comment is about one of the conclusions, and picking up in what Pedro was saying, it's younger people generally have less positive view than olders on the U.S. influence in the world. And this is something interesting. I also stressed the request of Pedro to Rita, if you could. Work on this, because I detected that in Portugal. I mean, young people have some negative feelings concerning the US, which is quite different from older generations. We have never had, in Portugal, we have never had negative experience with the US. Other European countries have, but we didn't. And we are very much an Atlantic country. It's our geography, it's our history, it's our geopolitical conditions. I see that in my sons and their friends, and I try to understand, and I ask, I try to give them the historic perspectives, the role of the US, First World War, Second World War, Marshall Plan, Cold War. They don't have a very precise idea about that, but they have a diffuse idea about US is too much involved in military conflicts. But Trump is a factor.
Absolutely.
And also the polarization in the US society, the racism, climate change, death penalty, abortion, these kind of things.
Guns.
But it's interesting that not so much the attack to the Congress in January 2021. So this is interesting, and if you could elaborate a bit on this and what you think about this, I would appreciate. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask you whether this deficit in perception or recognition on the part of the people, and in particular the young people in Portugal, about the dangers that China poses in terms, for instance, of new technologies, is that related to a deficit of information of what the implications are of what is is happening already in China? And that due to the interests of corporations here in Portugal, involved namely in the communications sector, that tells a different story, and of course all the network of the Confucius Institute and so on. I think if the young people would know better about the way the new technologies are being developed to exercise social and political control in China, and And if all the people, not just the young people, would understand how this threatens the security of our critical infrastructure, there would be more awareness. I think there is a major deficit in the perception of the dangers, and that's our common effort, I would say, to make the stories known. Because, for instance, about the US, every scandal that happens regarding the abuse of technology in the US is immediately broadcasted as immediately a lot of impact here, but not what's happening in China or with Chinese technology all over the world. And then my other question is exactly on this puzzling, to me it is puzzling a bit, that Portugal is one of the countries that gives you this highest mark in importance of the EU for national security. Of course, the EU, and I'm a defender of a EU common and security policy, but still very far away from being structured. So is this, and the figures are even higher than for NATO, so is this, do you think it is the reflection of a culture of dependency, parasitism, or is it also a conscience of the vulnerabilities of the country, and it implies a more holistic, strategic notion of security?
Okay. Difficult question.
Thank you again. I share many of the questions that have been on the table, and I have to say that this report raises as many questions as information, so it's easy to keep asking questions. Mine is a little bit awkward, maybe, but I'll see if I can be concrete. Your gatherings in this report, or along the different years you have been studying on these issues, could you be able to say something related to what is the kind of awareness in these 40 countries towards international politics? Not just on concrete issues, but to what extent our societies, particularly young people, are really engaged or involved in international issues. Because many of the questions, most of them, do have a linkage on international issues that needs a little bit of knowledge or awareness. And on the other hand, whatever answer may be given, it is very much related to the sense of belonging to a country and local politics. And not all the countries are equally open or equally, so to speak, not international, but oriented to one area or the other. So I'm very curious to know whether along these years you have a kind of assessment how people feel international politics. Thank you. That's it. Thank you so much.
I have a simple technical question. Is the entire report available to the public now? And if not, when might it be available?
Thank you. So let's start with the technical question.
Okay, but you know that giving the word to me is a bit dangerous because I also might comment on the other issues.
Please.
I will answer to that. Yes, the entire report is available to the public. It's available on the website of the German Marshall Fund, where you can find it, and we will also upload all the data sets, so all the Excels, very soon. I think that will be done in the first half of November. We are still just working on a few technical issues there, but the entire report is available, and the data sets will be available. If anyone needs them earlier, just email me. We can figure that out.
Can I ask you a question about this?
Sure.
So at some point we had access to a document where your team highlighted some findings about Portugal. Will that be available too?
We might want to proofread that one more,
Okay,
so that it has really the perfect format, but
somebody mentioned this.
yeah, I think we can make that available also in November if
Good,
necessary.
good. Excellent.
That can be feasible. I would like to pick up first also on that question of the kind of awareness towards politics. And last year, indeed, we had a question where we asked people how informed they are about foreign policy. And that question was not really interesting in terms of the results it produced. They were perfectly homogeneous across all age groups. They were across party affiliation, across region. And if you have that kind of results, that in all countries, across all factors is homogeneous, that's suspicious. So, and it was pretty much divided 50-50. Some people said they were informed, others said they were not informed. That's why we decided to take it out this year. We are thinking about potentially having it as a background question next year. But we also thought there are many good studies asking about foreign policy. Sorry about that, should make less gestures here. And you could basically do cross-referencing on that, because the Eurobarometer, for instance, from the European Commission also always has similar questions. That also, we discussed that questionnaires are limited and service polls cost money, so we had to say goodbye to that question, unfortunately, to do then cross-referencing. I would like to pick up on two more points, if I may.
Of course.
So first, this question of the importance of the EU and why the EU is seen as so important. I would say, indeed, it is potentially this idea of dependence of the EU. But here again, we don't know what the respondents understands when we tell them about security. Like, is it economic security? Is it hard security? Is it that sense of maybe even democracy belonging? Because basically the best questions do not spark knowledge, they spark emotions. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what people feel when they are hearing the EU. Do they have things like economic recovery in head? Do they think about arms delivery to Ukraine? We don't know. We can only guess. But indeed, we assume that it might be a mixture of all of them. And one last point before I give the word back to you on the younger people and the US perception. As someone who's only like 4 years older than the youngest age group and born after the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything and the Iron Curtain, I would say that it's really, and that's of course some subjectivity in that, and as someone who's coming from Germany where people are in general very, very, very pro-American, like in Germany you have people wearing US caps and US t-shirts on a daily basis because people basically love the US. But I would say in my generation it's really the image that has been shown by the US on the international scene, starting with 9/11, where or after 9/11, where you saw the US going abroad, seeing US military involvement in many places, that of course can be contested, but it is that image that people often have of the US. And then I remember that there was a Pew study a few years ago where people were asked whether they think that US democracy is a model for their country. And most people say that's not the case. So you have this complicated external dimension of US foreign policy, of these, I cite the word forever wars, of extensive US engagement abroad. And then the Trump trauma that is still very present, the looming scenario of a Trump 2.0 in 2 years again. Plus then, for example, also last year, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I think it is the accumulation of the foreign policy, plus this lack or the fact that US democracy is not perceived as a model, and then the aspects that were mentioned here, abortion, other aspects like the storm on the Capitol, the entire discussions on Black Lives Matter and so on. So I would say, yes, of course, that's also what was mentioned here, the issue of media coverage. Our media cover much more of domestic politics in the US than they cover on Chinese politics. And I would also say on European politics. We're reporting now already about elections in 2024 in the US, Has any media ever written about EU elections in 2024?
Thank you. I'm going to make some brief comments and then allow Raquel to close the session because we need to. I wanted to say something about awareness. It's a very, very difficult topic when you study public opinion, and especially when you study public opinion about foreign policy. It all depends on what we call awareness. So if awareness means knowledge, I can mostly guarantee that most people know extremely little about any of these issues. Yes, but to get there, I remember I worked on this. We worked on a survey for the National Defense Institute, where people were asked things about their vague notion about what was the budget for the military,
Yes.
and how many military people had no idea. And when they answered, they made the mistake by a factor of 10, right? Many years ago, I was involved in a survey where I asked people how much money did Portugal spend on health service. People underestimated it by a factor of 10. So no, in terms of I don't think people have that knowledge. Most people don't have that knowledge. And yet, as you said, you look at the report and you see reflected, at least in your opinion, and I think other people would share it, a kind of common sense. So where does this come from? I guess that this comes from the fact that people in these sorts of issues take their cues from sources that they believe, right? That they give credit to, from political elites, from political parties, and those sources give structure to these opinions. Even when you may disagree or you may agree with what people said, but they give a coherence that allows us, for example, to see that now the main cleavage about most of these issues is one that separates people who are close to the Communist Party from everybody else, which is a bit surprising. It might be surprising if you think, why not, the left bloc? But if you think about the discourse of the parties in the last 6 months, you understand what's creating this isolation of a particular group of people in comparison with others, because there's a broad, generic consensus about a lot of issues that separates. So I guess that the awareness, now perhaps, or the interest on these topics is higher than what it has ever been because of the geopolitical issues. The knowledge is very small, but the coherence is provided by this relationship that people maintain with sources that they give credit to, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I wanted to say, let me tell you a story about another survey. And this is related to a question that you asked. When the COVID thing started, Pedro Magalhães was involved. He's an expert in health economics. He was involved in a survey about attitudes in a bunch of countries, including Portugal, about COVID. And I remember distinctly this really interesting finding, which was, when you remember that app that was used to... So the Portuguese loved it. Guess who completely hated it? Germany. Of course. Privacy, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that one of the problems in raising the awareness about those issues is that, some countries, for very understandable reasons, are very invested in the protection of privacy. Other countries don't care very much, which means then that the coverage of these issues is very low and superficial, which then, of course, affects people's views about it, because this is where they get their information, where they start. So in a sense, I might say that the issue is insufficiently political in a broader sense, and it probably should be more. While, for example, in this COVID app example, you place this in front of a German, and it's also true in Scandinavia, and people are terrified because this is an extremely present issue in people's awareness and political discussion. But I have more things, but we don't have time. So I'll allow Raquel to close.
Thank you. Just to come back to the two questions that Anna presented, I think that I think we need more years, more surveys to actually answer your question. Is it instrumental, parasitic, in terms of building up a consensus or not around EU in terms of national security, defense, and so forth? I think the war in this year in particular is, I think, probably helps to explain. But I would also like to aggregate some of the other answers. For instance, when dealing with Russia or China, the overwhelming majority of Portuguese prefer to do that within the EU context. It may be because we are not a great power, we are aware that we are not, and because size actually matters regarding these two countries. It may be multiple reasons, but I think that also helps to explain. I think this year, for the most horrible reasons, has shown that either the EU and NATO have a value in itself. So that would be the first. The second one is, the world is clearly changing. We are in a transition phase. We have no idea how this is going to end, but we are definitely moving. And I think that when I was growing up, I remember being a teenager and thinking, what do I really want? I wanted Levi jeans, and I wanted an American flag all-stars. Those were like, and I got them. After extensive lobbying, I got them. But that was like my idea. Today, because of all the reasons that have been so very well explained, there is more competition in terms of brands, in terms of models, in terms of soft powers, and so forth. So the current United States society, and particularly, we are already starting to worry about the midterm elections because we might have a change in Congress. We are already worrying about the Trump 2.0, and that is a change. And that may have a systemic impact as well in our perception of, is that a role model? And lastly, I think that we definitely need greater awareness so that we can make a conscious choice regarding what China represents and means in terms of our values, in terms of our economic choices. And I think that's a big national discussion that we need to have, and that we need to move beyond the fact that we had Macau for so many years and so forth. So I think that's definitely a yes.
Thank you. So we need to close. We overstayed our welcome for a bit. So again, thank you very much for sponsoring this. Thank you very much for doing this. And thank you everybody for coming. And I hope next year at least we meet again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.